Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Attention has become currency, has become the raw material that corporations extract and refine and sell. And this transformation happened quietly, happened gradually, happened so smoothly that most people did not notice they were becoming the product, did not realize that their consciousness had been colonized, that the hours of their lives were being auctioned to the highest bidder, that every moment of awareness was being monetized by platforms designed not to inform or connect or entertain, but to harvest, to capture, to hold the gaze for as long as possible and convert that holding into profit. And the genius of this system is that it does not feel like exploitation, does not feel like theft, feels instead like choice, like freedom, like the vast menu of options that modernity provides. But the choice is curated, is algorithmically optimized, is designed to keep the user inside the platform, inside the feed, inside the cycle of stimulus and response that generates data. And the data is what matters. The data is what gets sold. The clicks and scrolls and pauses and searches that reveal preferences, reveal psychology, reveal the patterns that allow prediction. And prediction is control, is the ability to shape behavior, to nudge decisions, to make certain choices more likely than others. And this happens below the level of awareness, happens in the gap between stimulus and response, happens so quickly that by the time consciousness arrives to claim authorship of the decision has already been made, has been influenced by factors that were carefully engineered to be invisible, to operate in the blind spots of perception. And the engineers are not evil, are not villains, are just optimizing, are just doing what they are hired to do, which is maximize engagement. And engagement is measured in time, in how many minutes per day the user spends inside the system. And the system is very good at maximizing this metric, has been refined through millions of iterations, has been tested on billions of users, has discovered principles of human psychology that academic researchers never found, because researchers have ethics committees and platforms have incentives, and the incentive is to find the exact frequency of reward that keeps behavior going, the exact ratio of novelty to familiarity that prevents habituation, the exact level of difficulty that maintains interest without causing frustration, and these parameters are adjusted in real time, are personalized for each user, are tuned to the individual vulnerabilities that the data reveals. And what the data reveals is that humans are predictable, are hackable, are machines that respond to inputs in ways that can be modeled and exploited. And the exploitation is not illegal, is not even considered unethical by the standards of the industry. It's just business, just capitalism, just the market finding new territory to colonize. And the territory is consciousness, is the hours of the day that used to be empty, used to be boring, used to be filled with thought or rest or staring at walls. And these empty hours were not profitable, were not monetizable, were waste from an economic perspective, and so they had to be filled, had to be captured, had to be converted into engagement. And the tools for this conversion are apps, are platforms, are devices that promise connection and deliver isolation, promise information and deliver distraction, promise empowerment and deliver addiction. And the addiction is not metaphorical, is not exaggeration, is literal, is the same neural pathways, the same dopamine dynamics, the same withdrawal symptoms that characterize substance addiction. And the platforms know this, have hired neuroscientists and psychologists to make the products more addictive, more compelling, more difficult to resist, and resistance is framed as weakness, as lack of self-control, as personal failing. But this framing obscures the asymmetry of power, obscures the fact that individuals are competing against teams of PhDs with unlimited resources and sophisticated tools. And in this competition, the individual always loses, always ends up scrolling, always ends up checking, always ends up giving the platform what it wants, which is attention. And attention is finite, is the one resource that cannot be manufactured or expanded, is strictly limited by the hours in a day and the capacity of the nervous system. And so the competition for attention is zero-sum, is a war where every platform is fighting every other platform, and all of them are fighting against sleep and work and relationships and anything else that might occupy consciousness. And the platforms are winning, are capturing more hours every year, are extending their reach into moments that used to be sacred, used to be protected, used to be offline. And offline is becoming a luxury, is becoming something only the wealthy can afford, because opting out requires discipline and alternatives and the knowledge that opting out is even possible. And most people do not have this knowledge, do not see the system, do not recognize that their attention is being farmed. And even those who do recognize it often cannot escape, cannot resist, because the platforms are too useful, too convenient, too integrated into the infrastructure of modern life. And to reject them is to reject participation, to accept isolation, to make life harder in exchange for autonomy. And most choose convenience over autonomy, choose connection over sovereignty, choose the platform over the void. And the void is what waits in the absence of stimulation, is what the constant connectivity is designed to prevent, is boredom, is the experience of being alone with the unoccupied mind. And boredom has become intolerable, has become something to be avoided at all costs. And the cost is attention, is consciousness, is the capacity to think without distraction, to feel without mediation, to simply be without needing external input. And this capacity is atrophying, is declining with each generation, is being bred out by an environment that never stops demanding response, that never allows rest, that treats every moment of inactivity as opportunity, as potential engagement that must be captured. And the capturing is called user experience, is called interface design, is called growth hacking. And these terms sanitize what is happening, make it sound technical rather than predatory, make it sound like optimization rather than exploitation. But the experience of the user is not optimized for the user, is optimized for the platform, is designed to extract maximum value from minimum input. And the value extracted is not just attention, but data, not just time, but information, not just engagement, but identity, because the platforms know things about their users that the users do not know about themselves, have models of personality and preference that are more accurate than self-report. And these models are sold, are licensed, are used to manipulate. And the manipulation is called advertising, but is really behavior modification, is the application of psychological principles to make certain actions more likely. And the actions are clicking and buying and voting and believing. And what is believed is whatever the algorithm decides to show. Whatever content the model predicts will generate engagement. And engagement means time, means attention, means the user staying inside the system. And the system has learned that outrage generates engagement, that fear generates engagement, that tribalism and conflict and moral certainty generate engagement. And so these are what the algorithm promotes, what the feed becomes filled with, not because the platform wants a more divided world, but because division is profitable, keeps people scrolling, keeps people arguing, keeps attention captured. And the captured attention is sold to advertisers who want to change behavior, who want to make people buy products they do not need, believe things that are not true, vote for candidates who do not serve their interests, and the system works, is terrifyingly effective. Has changed elections, has changed culture, has changed what people think is real, and reality is becoming whatever the algorithm amplifies, whatever goes viral, whatever captures attention long enough to become part of the discourse. And the discourse is not conversation but performance, not exchange but broadcast, not thinking but reacting. And reaction is what the system wants, is faster than reflection, is more primitive, is easier to predict and manipulate. And so the environment rewards reaction, punishes reflection, makes it difficult to think slowly, to consider carefully, to withhold judgment. And the result is a population that is always responding, always reacting, always engaged but never thoughtful, never deliberate, never in control of their own attention. And attention is the foundation of everything else, is what makes learning possible, makes relationships possible, makes meaning possible. And when attention is colonized, everything built on attention becomes precarious, becomes shallow, becomes vulnerable to collapse. And the collapse is already happening, is visible in the epidemic of anxiety and depression, in the inability to focus, in the fragmentation of identity, in the sense that life is accelerating, that there is never enough time, that something important is being lost, but it is not clear what or how to get it back. And what is being lost is sovereignty, is the right to one's own consciousness, the right to choose what to pay attention to, rather than having attention hijacked, manipulated, sold. And the platforms will say that users have choice, that no one is forced to use these services, that opting out is always possible. But this is disingenuous, is like saying that people choose to breathe polluted air because they could move, could leave the city, could find somewhere clean. And technically, this is true, but practically, it ignores the structure of power, ignores that the environment has been changed in ways that make certain choices extremely costly. That opting out of the attention economy means opting out of employment, education, social connection, civic participation. And so the choice is not really a choice, is coerced by circumstance, by the fact that the platforms have become infrastructure, have become the roads on which modern life travels. And to refuse them is to refuse modernity, to accept marginalization, and most cannot afford this refusal. And so they stay, keep scrolling, keep checking, keep giving away their attention, and receiving in return the feeling of being connected, being informed, being free, when really they are isolated, distracted, captured. And the freedom is the freedom of the hamster wheel, the freedom to run without going anywhere, the freedom to choose between options that have all been curated to serve the same end, and the end is profit, is the conversion of attention into money, is the monetization of consciousness itself. And this monetization was not possible before, was not technically feasible, required technologies that did not exist, required smartphones and algorithms, and the infrastructure to track and analyze and predict behavior in real time. And now that the infrastructure exists, it will not be dismantled, will not be voluntarily abandoned, because it's too valuable, too profitable, too central to the business models of the most powerful corporations in history. And these corporations are not accountable to users, are accountable to shareholders, and shareholders care about growth, care about returns, care about the numbers going up. And the numbers go up when engagement goes up, when attention is captured more effectively, when the competition is crushed and the market is monopolized. And monopoly is what has been achieved, is what the platform economy tends toward, because platforms benefit from network effects, from being where everyone else is. And this creates winner-take-all dynamics, creates situations where one or two platforms dominate, and alternatives cannot compete, cannot offer enough value to overcome the switching costs. And so the users are locked in, are prisoners of convenience, are unable to leave without losing access to the networks that have become essential. And the platforms know this, exploit this, degrade the experience slowly, introduce features that users hate but tolerate because the alternative is worse, is disconnection, and disconnection is unthinkable, has become synonymous with isolation, has become the thing that the attention economy promises to save us from while actually delivering it. Because connection through a screen is not connection, is simulation of connection, is the appearance without the substance, is the feeling without the reality. And the reality is that real connection requires presence, requires attention that is not divided, not distracted, not mediated by an algorithm that is optimizing for something other than the relationship. And such attention is becoming rare, is becoming a gift that few can afford to give, because attention is the thing being taken, is the thing being sold, is the thing that there is never enough of, because it is always being redirected, always being pulled toward the next notification, the next update, the next thing designed to capture and hold and extract. And the extraction is invisible, feels like nothing, feels like just a moment, just a quick check, just staying informed. But the moments accumulate, the checks compound, and hours dissolve into fragmented minutes, into broken attention that cannot sustain thought, cannot maintain focus, cannot build anything that requires depth or complexity or sustained engagement. And depth is what is being lost, is what the attention economy is incompatible with, because depth requires time, requires the ability to stay with difficulty, to tolerate confusion, to sit with questions that do not have immediate answers. And the platforms cannot tolerate this, cannot allow users to sit, must keep them moving, must keep them scrolling, must keep them in the state of perpetual seeking that never finds, perpetual consuming that never satisfies. And satisfaction is the enemy, is what would cause the user to stop, to disengage, to leave the platform. And so satisfaction must be prevented, must be deferred, must be replaced with the promise of satisfaction, with the feeling that the next thing will be the thing, the next scroll will reveal something worth the time. And this promise is never fulfilled, is never intended to be fulfilled, is the mechanism that keeps the machine running, keeps the user trapped in the loop. And escape requires recognizing the loop, requires seeing the mechanism, requires understanding that the feeling of freedom is the trap, that the choice is the cage, that the attention economy is not serving the user but is using the user, is extracting value and leaving behind exhaustion, fragmentation, the sense that life is happening somewhere else, to someone else, and the screen is a window onto that other life, but never a door, never a way through, only a way to watch, to consume, to experience vicariously. And vicarious experience is not experience, is its negation, is the replacement of doing with watching, of living with scrolling, of being with performing. And performance is what the platforms demand. Demand the curation of identity, the presentation of self that is always positive, always successful, always enviable. And this performance is exhausting, is alienating, is the source of the anxiety that drives people back to the platforms looking for relief. And the platforms provide relief in the form of more content, more distraction, more opportunities to forget that the self being performed is not the self being lived, that the gap between them is growing, that authenticity is becoming impossible in an environment that punishes vulnerability and rewards spectacle. And spectacle is what the algorithm amplifies. What goes viral, what captures attention at scale, and attention at scale is what matters, is what generates revenue, is what makes certain voices loud and others silent. And the silence is not absence but erasure, is the algorithmic decision that certain content does not generate engagement, does not deserve distribution, does not align with the platform's interests, and interests are commercial, are about keeping users inside the system, and anything that might cause users to leave, to think, to question, to disconnect, is deprioritized, is hidden, is effectively censored not by decree but by code, by the automated decisions of systems that have no conception of truth or value or importance, only of engagement, And engagement is the wrong metric, is optimizing for the wrong thing, is maximizing time spent rather than time well spent. And the distinction matters because not all attention is equal. Some attention is nourishing and some is depleting. Some makes life richer and some makes it poorer. But the algorithm cannot distinguish, does not care, measures only duration and intensity. And intensity is easy to generate through outrage, through fear, through the triggering of emotions that demand response. And so the feed becomes a stream of triggers, becomes designed to provoke, to upset, to capture attention through the primitive circuits that evolved to detect threat. And these circuits are not designed for the modern world, are designed for a world where threats were physical, immediate, escapable, not abstract, permanent, global, and the mismatch creates chronic activation, creates a state of perpetual vigilance that wears down the nervous system, that depletes resources, that makes rest impossible because the threats never stop, the feed never ends, the notifications never cease, and the only way to stop them is to disconnect, to turn off, to reclaim attention. But disconnection feels dangerous, feels like missing something, feels like falling behind, and falling behind is unacceptable in a culture that valorizes productivity, that measures worth in output, that treats every moment as resource to be optimized. And optimization means elimination of waste. And waste includes rest, includes boredom, includes the empty time that used to be when consciousness could wander, could explore, could discover itself. And this discovery is what is being prevented, is what the colonization of attention makes impossible. Because to know oneself requires attention turned inward, requires time that is not filled, requires boredom. And boredom is not absence, but presence, is the mind meeting itself without distraction, without mediation, without escape. And this meeting is where insight comes from, where creativity comes from, where meaning comes from. But the platforms cannot monetize insight, cannot sell creativity, cannot profit from meaning. And so these are sacrificed, are traded for engagement, for the illusion of productivity, for the feeling of being busy that is actually being used, being exploited, being colonized. And the colonization is complete when it becomes invisible, when it feels like nature, when the user cannot imagine life without the platform, cannot remember what attention felt like before it was captured, cannot conceive of consciousness that is not mediated, not monetized, not owned by someone else. And ownership is what has been achieved, is what the attention economy has accomplished, not through force but through design, through the slow accumulation of habits that become dependencies, through the gradual adjustment of expectations until constant connectivity feels normal and solitude feels strange. And strange is threatening, is to be avoided, is what the platform protects against, promises to eliminate, and the elimination is achieved, is total, is the end of privacy, the end of interiority, the end of the self that is not performing, not producing, not consuming. And what remains is the user, the node in the network, the data point in the model, the attention that is harvested and sold and never returned. And the question is whether this is sustainable, whether consciousness can survive colonization, whether attention can be extracted indefinitely without something breaking, and the breaking is already happening, is visible in the rising rates of mental illness, in the inability to be alone, in the desperation for distraction that feels like drowning, like suffocation, like something essential has been taken and cannot be recovered. And recovery would require resistance, would require the deliberate cultivation of boredom, the intentional creation of empty time, the radical act of doing nothing in a world that demands constant doing. And doing nothing is not laziness, but rebellion, is the refusal to participate, is the reclamation of sovereignty, is the assertion that attention is not for sale, that consciousness is not a resource, that the self has value independent of productivity, independent of engagement, independent of what can be extracted. And this assertion is difficult, is countercultural, is fighting against systems that are designed to prevent it. But it is possible, is necessary, is the only way to escape the colonization, to restore attention to its proper owner, to make consciousness sovereign again. And sovereignty is not isolation, but autonomy, is the right to choose, the right to refuse, the right to be bored, to be slow, to be present. And presence is what the attention economy destroys, is what cannot be monetized, is what makes life worth living. And without it, all the engagement in the world is empty, is meaningless, is just motion, just noise, just the sound of attention being sold. Belief does not wait for evidence, does not require justification, does not emerge from careful reasoning, but appears fully formed, arrives with conviction intact, and only afterward does the mind scramble to find reasons, to construct arguments, to build the scaffolding of rationality around a conclusion that was never reached through rationality in the first place. And this sequence is backward from what is taught, from what people believe about their own thinking, from the narrative that says humans are rational creatures who form beliefs by weighing evidence and following logic to wherever it leads. But the narrative is false, is a story the conscious mind tells about processes. It does not control and barely witnesses, because the formation of belief happens beneath awareness, happens in systems that operate according to principles that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with survival, with coalition, with identity, with the deep need to belong to a group and signal loyalty to that group through the adoption of its beliefs. And the adoption is not chosen, is not deliberate, is automatic, is the result of exposure and repetition and emotional resonance. And once a belief is formed, it becomes self-protecting, becomes resistant to challenge, becomes the lens through which all subsequent information is filtered. And the filter is not neutral, does not simply organize data, but actively distorts it, amplifies what confirms and minimizes what contradicts. And this distortion is not dishonesty, but cognition, is the normal operation of a mind that is not designed to find truth, but to maintain coherence, to protect existing beliefs from disintegration, to avoid the cognitive and social costs of changing one's mind. And the costs are high, are often higher than the costs of being wrong, because being wrong in private is invisible, but changing one's mind in public is betrayal, is defection, is the signal that one is unreliable, is not committed, is willing to abandon the group. And groups punish this, punish uncertainty, punish the appearance of wavering, reward certainty even when the certainty is unjustified, especially when it is unjustified. Because justified certainty requires evidence, and evidence is ambiguous, and ambiguity is threatening to group cohesion, but unjustified certainty, certainty that comes from faith, from commitment, from identity, is the strongest signal of loyalty, is the proof that one believes not because the evidence compels, but because the group demands, and this demand is the engine of belief, is what makes convictions stick, what makes them resistant to argument, what makes smart people believe wrong things, not despite their intelligence, but because of it. Because intelligence is a tool, and tools can be used for any purpose, including the purpose of defending beliefs that were never formed through intelligence in the first place. And the defense is sophisticated, is elaborate, is often more complex than the defenses offered by less intelligent believers, because the intelligent mind has more resources, more information, more ability to construct rationalizations that sound convincing, that appear logical, that give the impression of having been arrived at through careful thought when really they are working backward from a conclusion that was never in question. And the conclusion was never in question because it was not a conclusion but a premise, was not the end of reasoning but the beginning, was the starting point that determined which evidence would be noticed, which arguments would be persuasive, which authorities would be trusted, And trust is not distributed evenly across all sources, but is allocated according to alignment, according to whether the source supports the belief or challenges it. And sources that support are credible, are reliable, are worth listening to, while sources that challenge are biased, are corrupt, are motivated by hidden agendas. And this asymmetry is not recognized by the believer, is not seen as bias but as discernment, as the ability to distinguish good information from bad. And the distinguishing is easy because good information is information that confirms, and bad information is information that contradicts. And this is motivated reasoning, is the process by which the mind arrives at the conclusions it wants to arrive at while maintaining the illusion of objectivity, the sense that the conclusion was forced by evidence rather than selected in advance, and the illusion is convincing, is believed by the person doing the reasoning, is not cynical manipulation, but sincere self-deception, is the mind fooling itself, because being fooled is useful, is adaptive, is what allows people to hold beliefs with confidence, even when the beliefs are unsupported, and confidence is what matters socially, is what others respond to, is what makes a belief persuasive, not because it's true, but because it's held strongly, and strength of conviction is mistaken for strength of evidence, is treated as signal that the believer knows something, has access to information, has done the thinking, when really the strength comes from identity, from the fact that the belief is tied to who the person is, to what group they belong to what side they are on. And sides are not chosen through reasoning, are chosen through affiliation, through accidents of birth and circumstance, through exposure to certain narratives at formative moments. And once the side is chosen, the beliefs come with it, come as package, come as the price of membership. And the price is paid gladly, because membership is worth more than truth, is worth more than accuracy, is the thing that makes life meaningful, that provides identity, that offers protection. And protection requires conformity, requires that everyone in the group believes the same things, or at least claims to believe them. And the claiming becomes believing through repetition, through public commitment, through the performance of belief that eventually converts into genuine conviction. And the conversion happens without awareness, happens gradually, happens through the mechanism that psychologists call cognitive dissonance reduction, where the mind alters beliefs to match behavior because behavior is harder to change, is more visible, is more socially consequential, and so the internal adjusts to match the external, and what was performed becomes believed, and what was believed becomes identity. And identity is the deepest level, is the level at which challenge feels like attack, like assault on the self, and the self defends, mobilizes resources, recruits intelligence in service of protection, and intelligence is effective, is dangerous in this role, because it can construct arguments that are superficially compelling, that exploit real ambiguities in evidence, that find the weak points in opposing positions. And these arguments are not offered in search of truth, but in defense of identity. Are weapons, not tools, are designed to win, not to discover, and winning means making the other side look wrong, look foolish, look motivated by bias, and the accusation of bias is always available, is always applicable, because everyone is biased, everyone is motivated, everyone is reasoning from premises they did not choose, and cannot justify except by appeal to other premises they also did not choose. And so the accusations are symmetrical, are hurled back and forth without resolution, without movement, without any possibility of convergence, because convergence would require both sides to treat truth as the goal, to be willing to change their minds if evidence demanded it. But evidence never demands anything. Evidence is passive, is interpreted, is filtered through the beliefs that are already in place. And the beliefs that are already in place are determined by identity, by group membership, by tribal affiliation, and tribes do not care about truth except insofar as truth claims serve tribal interests, serve to distinguish us from them, serve to mark boundaries, to maintain cohesion, to provide narratives that explain why we are good and they are bad, why our beliefs are justified and theirs are delusions. And the asymmetry is total, is never recognized as asymmetry, but always experienced as accurate perception, as seeing clearly while others are blind, and the blindness is attributed to stupidity or dishonesty or indoctrination, never to the same mechanisms that are operating in oneself, because one's own beliefs are transparent, are not seen as beliefs but as obvious facts, as the way things are, and the way things are is not up for debate, is not subject to revision, is the foundation on which everything else is built, and challenging the foundation threatens the structure, threatens everything. And so the challenge is rejected, is deflected, is met with hostility or mockery, or the dismissal that treats the challenger as not worth engaging, as beneath consideration, as so obviously wrong that responding would be a waste of time. And the waste is avoided, the belief is preserved, the identity is protected, and life continues with certainty intact, with the conviction that one is right, has always been right, will always be right, because being right is not a state that can be verified, but is a state that is claimed, is performed, is the stance that the group requires and the individual provides. And the providing is not sacrifice, but fulfillment, is not loss but gain, is the way that belonging is achieved, is the way that meaning is found, is the way that the chaos of existence is organized into a coherent narrative where the self is on the right side, is part of the good, is aligned with truth, even if truth is never actually encountered, never actually sought, never actually valued except as a rhetorical weapon to use against opponents. And opponents are necessary, are required by the logic of tribal epistemology, are the ones whose wrongness confirms our rightness, whose existence justifies our beliefs, whose errors prove our accuracy, and the errors are easy to find, because looking for errors is what confirmation bias does, is the selective attention that notices everything that supports the belief and overlooks everything that contradicts it. And the overlooking is not deliberate, is not conscious suppression, but automatic filtering. Is the mind attending to what it expects, what it is primed to see, and the priming comes from belief, comes from the framework that determines what is salient, what is relevant, what is worth noticing, and what is worth noticing is always what confirms, is always what can be incorporated into the narrative, and the narrative is not discovered but constructed, is built from selected pieces of evidence that are arranged to tell a story, and the story is always the same story, is always the one where we are right and they are wrong, where our beliefs are based on evidence and theirs are based on bias, where we are rational and they are emotional, where we are honest seekers of truth and they are motivated by power or fear, or some other corrupt motive, and the motives that are attributed to others are never attributed to the self, are never seen as operating in one's own reasoning, because one's own reasoning is transparent, is experienced as simply responding to facts, as following evidence, as arriving at conclusions that are forced rather than chosen, and the forcing as illusion is the feeling that arises when motivated reasoning is operating smoothly, when the mind has successfully convinced itself that the conclusion it wanted to reach is the conclusion that evidence demands, and the demand is retroactive, is constructed after the fact, is the rationalization that makes the belief feel justified, that allows it to be held with confidence, that enables the believer to defend it against challenge and feel virtuous in the defending. And virtue is the reward, is what makes belief feel good, feel right, feel like something more than preference, and the more than preference is what gives belief its power, its capacity to motivate action, to organize communities, to inspire sacrifice, because preference can be changed, can be updated, can be revealed as merely subjective, but belief that is felt as knowledge, as truth, as correspondence to reality, is not subject to change, is not vulnerable to challenge, is the rock on which identity is built. And the rock is not geology but psychology, is not objective but constructed, is not discovered in the world but imposed on the world. And the imposition is what makes the world intelligible, what makes experience coherent, What prevents the vertigo of radical uncertainty, and uncertainty is intolerable, is the state that humans will do almost anything to avoid, will believe almost anything to escape, and the escape is into certainty, into conviction, into the feeling of knowing. And the feeling is what matters, is what provides comfort, is what makes belief functional regardless of whether it is true, and truth is a secondary concern, is something that is appealed to but not pursued, is a value that is claimed but not practiced, because practicing it would require epistemic humility, would require admitting that one could be wrong, that one's beliefs could be mistaken, that the group could be misguided, and these admissions are costly, are signals of weakness, are invitations for opponents to attack. An attack is what happens when certainty is dropped, when doubt is expressed, when the fortress of belief shows cracks and the cracks are not tolerated, are repaired immediately, are filled with rationalizations and justifications, and appeals to authority. And authority is not expertise but alignment, is not knowledge but membership, is the voice of the group speaking through individuals who have internalized its beliefs so thoroughly that they cannot distinguish their own thoughts from the thoughts they were given, and the giving is not noticed, is not experienced as indoctrination, but as education, as the transmission of knowledge, as the inheritance of wisdom. And wisdom is what every group claims to possess, is the special access to truth that justifies its existence, that explains why belonging matters, why loyalty is required, why defection is unforgivable, and the unforgivable is treated with expulsion, with shunning, with the withdrawal of recognition that makes social existence possible, and the possibility of this withdrawal is what keeps believers in line, keeps them performing the beliefs, even when doubt arises, even when evidence contradicts, even when the rational part of the mind recognizes that the belief is unsupported, because the rational part is weak, is outvoted by the social part, by the emotional part, by the parts that understand that survival depends on belonging, and belonging depends on belief. And so belief is maintained, is performed, is protected against challenge, not because it is true, but because it's necessary, is the price of membership, is the cost of identity, and the cost is paid continuously, is paid in the suppression of doubt, in the dismissal of contrary evidence, in the construction of elaborate rationalizations that allow the belief to persist despite its failures, despite its contradictions, despite the mounting evidence that it is wrong, and wrong is what every belief eventually becomes, is the fate of all convictions that are held rigidly, that refuse to update, that treat themselves as final, as complete, as not subject to revision, because the world changes, because evidence accumulates, because what was plausible becomes implausible, and the implausible becomes undeniable, and the undeniable is denied anyway, is rejected through the mechanisms of motivated reasoning that are so powerful, so sophisticated, so effective at maintaining belief in the face of counter-evidence that they can preserve convictions long after those convictions have ceased to correspond to anything in reality. And the lack of correspondence does not matter, does not affect the strength of belief, does not reduce confidence, because belief is not about correspondence, is not about mapping the world accurately, is about maintaining identity, maintaining belonging, maintaining the narratives that make the group cohere. And coherence is more important than accuracy, is more valuable than truth, is what holds communities together, what makes collective action possible, what allows humans to coordinate at scale. And scale requires shared belief, requires that everyone is operating from the same assumptions, the same frameworks, the same narratives, and the sharing is not achieved through evidence, but through repetition, through ritual, through the constant reinforcement of the beliefs that define the group. And the reinforcement is everywhere, is in the stories that are told, the heroes that are celebrated, the enemies that are vilified, the history that is remembered and the history that is forgotten, and the remembering and forgetting are selective, are curated to support the narrative, to make the group look good, to make its beliefs seem justified, seem necessary, seem like the only reasonable position. And reasonableness is performance, is the appearance of having arrived at belief through rational process, when really the process is post hoc, is the construction of justification for conclusions that were reached through identity, through emotion, through the non-rational processes that govern most of human belief. And the most is almost all, is the vast majority of what people believe. Is believed not because evidence compels, but because believing is required, is expected, is the condition of membership in the groups that provide meaning and purpose and protection. And without these groups, the individual is lost, is isolated, is without framework, without narrative, without the stories that make sense of suffering, that explain why things happen, that provide hope that the future will be better, or at least that the struggle is meaningful. And meaning is what belief provides, is the primary function, is more important than accuracy, more valuable than truth. Because humans can tolerate being wrong, but cannot tolerate meaninglessness, cannot survive without the sense that life is going somewhere, that actions matter, that the side they are on is the right side, and the right side is always the side they are on, is always the group they belong to, is determined by belonging rather than determining it. And this circularity is invisible, is not recognized as circularity, but experienced as logical necessity, as the way things obviously are. And the obvious is what is most suspect, is what most needs examination, is where belief is most rigid, most defended, most immune to challenge, because the obvious is the foundation, is the premise that cannot be questioned without everything else collapsing. And collapse is unacceptable, is the threat that keeps belief in place, that makes certainty feel like safety and doubt feel like danger. And so certainty wins, always. Wins not because it is right, but because it is functional, is what the mind needs to operate, to make decisions, to navigate the world. And navigation does not require truth, only requires consistency, requires beliefs that are stable enough to be acted upon. And stability is what identity provides, is what tribal epistemology achieves, is the freezing of belief into doctrine, into dogma, into the unquestionable truths that define the group and exclude the other. And exclusion is the point, is the function, is what makes identity possible. Because identity is not what you are, but what you're not, is defined by boundaries, by the line that separates us from them, believers from heretics, the enlightened from the deluded. And the delusion is always on the other side, is always what they suffer from, never what afflicts us, because we see clearly we have truth, we are right, and the rightness is not a conclusion but a premise, is not the end of inquiry but the foreclosing of inquiry, is the state that belief aims for and maintains through every mechanism available, through confirmation bias, through motivated reasoning, through tribal epistemology, through the subordination of truth to identity. And the subordination is complete, is total, is the condition of believing anything at all. Because belief without evidence is not the exception, but the rule is not a failure of reasoning, but the normal operation of minds that are not designed for truth, but for survival, for belonging, for the construction of narratives that make life bearable. And bearable is all that is required, is all that can be expected, is the standard that belief meets regardless of whether it meets any other standard, and other standards are luxuries, are the concerns of those who have the security to question, to doubt, to examine their beliefs, without fearing the social consequences. But most do not have this security. Most cannot afford doubt, cannot risk uncertainty, cannot survive without the conviction that they are right, that their beliefs are justified, that the group they belong to has access to truth. And the access is never demonstrated, never verified, never subjected to test, is only asserted, only performed, only maintained through the constant repetition of the beliefs that constitute the group. And the constitution is circular, is self-referential, is the tautology that defines all tribal epistemology. That we are right, because we believe what we believe, and we believe what we believe because we are right, and the circle is unbreakable from within, can only be seen from outside, from the perspective of someone who does not share the belief, who has not internalized the identity, who can see the mechanisms operating, and the seeing changes. Nothing convinces no one, because the believer is not operating from evidence and cannot be swayed by evidence, is operating from identity and can only be swayed by changes in identity, by shifts in belonging, by the rare and difficult transformation that allows a person to leave one group and join another, to abandon one set of beliefs and adopt another. And the adoption is not reasoned, but is the same non-rational process operating in a different direction, is the formation of new convictions without evidence, is the replacement of one certainty with another certainty. And the certainty is what matters, is what the mind needs, is what belief provides, regardless of content, regardless of truth, regardless of anything except the function of making the world intelligible, making the self coherent, making belonging possible. And possibility is all that belief promises, is all that it delivers, is the opening of a space where life can be lived with conviction, with purpose, with the sense that one knows what is true and what is false, what is good and what is evil, what side to be on and what side to oppose, and the opposition is necessary, is required by the structure of belief, is what makes belief matter, what gives it weight, what makes it worth defending, worth fighting for, worth holding on to, even when every rational consideration suggests it should be abandoned, because abandoning belief is abandoning identity, is abandoning belonging, is abandoning meaning, and meaning is what makes existence tolerable, is what makes life worth living. And this worth is not measured in truth, but in function, not in correspondence, but in coherence, not in accuracy, but in the capacity to organize experience into narratives that can be shared, that can be believed, that can be held, with the conviction that comes not from evidence but from faith. And faith is not the opposite of reason, but its foundation is the ground on which all reasoning occurs, is the set of premises that cannot themselves be justified but must be assumed, must be taken on faith, must be believed without evidence, because evidence requires premises, and premises require faith, and the faith is inescapable, is built into the structure of belief, is what makes belief possible, is what makes the mechanics of belief mechanical, automatic, operating below awareness, producing convictions that arrive fully formed and are only later dressed in the clothing of reason, given the appearance of having been derived from evidence when really they were derived from identity, from belonging, from the deep and desperate human need to be part of something larger, to believe something strongly, to know with certainty, even if the knowing is illusion, and the certainty is performance, and the belief is wrong. The eye cannot see itself without a mirror, and even then what appears in the reflection is reversed, backward, fundamentally altered by the act of observation. And this simple fact about vision contains within it a deeper truth about consciousness, about the strange recursive loop that happens when awareness tries to become aware of itself, when the mind attempts to know the mind, when the self turns inward to discover what the self actually is, and what it finds, or thinks it finds, is never quite the thing doing the finding, never quite the observer, but always the observed, always one step removed, always a representation rather than the thing itself. And this gap, this irreducible distance between the knower and the known, when both are supposedly the same entity, creates a problem that has troubled philosophers since humans first developed the capacity to ask who they are, a problem that might not have a solution because the very structure of self-knowledge contains a contradiction, a paradox built into the architecture of introspection that makes genuine self-understanding not just difficult, but perhaps logically impossible. The ancient Greeks carved into the temple at Delphi the command to know thyself, and Socrates spent his life insisting that the unexamined life is not worth living, that self-knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, the beginning of philosophy, the path to virtue, but Socrates also claimed to know nothing, claimed that his only wisdom was recognizing his ignorance, and perhaps these two positions are connected. Perhaps the examination of the self leads inevitably to the discovery that the self cannot be known, that the more carefully one looks inward, the more elusive the thing being sought becomes, like trying to grasp water or catch one's own shadow. And this elusiveness is not an accident, not a failure of attention or effort, but something essential to what consciousness is, something about how the mind works that makes it constitutively opaque to itself, forever mysterious, forever strange. When someone sits quietly and tries to observe their own thoughts, tries to watch the mind in action, something peculiar happens. The thoughts change. They become different thoughts, self-conscious thoughts, thoughts about thinking, and the original spontaneous flow of mental activity that was supposed to be observed has already been altered by the act of observation, has been replaced by a different kind of mental activity, the activity of observing. And this is the observer effect in consciousness, borrowed from quantum physics, where the act of measurement changes what is being measured, where particles behave differently when watched. And though the analogy is imperfect, though consciousness is not exactly like quantum systems, there is something similar happening, something about awareness that transforms its object, that cannot leave things as they are. And this means that introspection is never neutral, never a clear window onto the mind, but always an intervention, always a distortion. And what is seen in introspection is not the mind as it normally operates, but the mind as it operates when being observed, which is a different mind, a mind in a different state, performing a different function. The psychologist Timothy Wilson calls this the introspection illusion, the false belief that people have direct access to their mental processes, that they can simply look inward and discover why they feel what they feel, why they believe what they believe, why they did what they did. But decades of research in cognitive psychology show that introspection is unreliable, that people confidently report reasons for their behavior that are simply wrong, that they confabulate explanations without realizing they are confabulating, that the mind generates plausible sounding stories about itself, but these stories are not reports from the inside, are not transcripts of actual mental processes, but rather are post hoc rationalizations, narratives constructed after the fact to make sense of actions that were caused by processes the conscious mind never had access to in the first place. In one famous experiment, researchers showed people photographs and asked them to choose which face they found more attractive. And after the choice was made, the researchers used sleight of hand to swap the photographs, showing people the face they did not choose and asking them to explain why they chose it. And the majority of people did not notice the switch, did not realize they were explaining a choice they never made, and they generated detailed explanations, talked about the eyes, the smile, the overall impression, completely convinced they were reporting genuine introspective insights, when in fact they were making up reasons, on the spot, confabulating freely. And this was not lying, was not intentional deception, because the people genuinely believed their own explanations, genuinely felt they were accurately describing their mental processes. But they were not, they were creating a story. And this is what introspection often is, not discovery, but creation, not observation, but fabrication. And the frightening part is that it feels identical from the inside. There is no phenomenological difference between genuine self-knowledge and convincing self-deception. No way to tell, just by introspecting, whether the reasons being accessed are real or invented, whether the self-understanding being achieved is accurate or illusory. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle argued against what he called the ghost in the machine, against the Cartesian idea that there is an inner mental theatre where a homunculus, a little person inside the head, watches experiences unfold on a screen. And Ryle pointed out that this model leads to infinite regress, because if there is a homunculus watching the screen, then what is watching the homunculus. What is aware of the awareness? And this question repeats indefinitely, creating an infinite stack of observers, which is absurd, which suggests the model is wrong, that consciousness is not structured like a theatre with an audience, that there is no central viewing point, no little self inside observing the big self. But if this is true, if there is no homunculus, then what is introspection? What is happening when it feels like the self is observing itself? And the answer might be that nothing is being observed, that introspection is a kind of cognitive illusion, a trick the brain plays, a way of accessing some information about its own state but mistaking this limited, partial access for complete transparency, for total self-knowledge, when really most of what the brain does is hidden, is unconscious, is inaccessible to the part that thinks it is doing the knowing. Freud built an entire therapeutic method on the premise that the self is largely unknown to itself, that beneath the conscious mind lies the unconscious, vast and dark and full of repressed desires, traumatic memories, primitive drives, and that the work of psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious, to bring into awareness what has been hidden, to achieve insight. And for Freud, insight was curative. Knowing why you're anxious or depressed or behaving strangely would dissolve the symptom, would free you from the tyranny of forces you did not understand. But the history of psychoanalysis is also a history of people discovering things about themselves that they do not recognize, that feel foreign, that seem like they must belong to someone else. And the analyst says, "This is you. This desire, this rage, this fear." And the patient says, "No, that is not me. I do not feel that way." And the analyst says, "You are resisting. You are defending against the truth." And maybe the analyst is right. Maybe resistance is real. But maybe also the patient is right. Maybe what the analyst is finding through interpretation is not the hidden self, but another construct, another story, not more true than the patient's own story, just differently structured. And the question becomes, whose interpretation counts as knowledge? Who gets to say what the self really is when the self being analysed does not recognise itself in the analysis? Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, took a different approach, argued that the therapist should not interpret, should not claim to know the client better than the client knows themselves, but should rather create conditions where the client can explore their own experience, can come to their own understanding. And Rogers believed that people have an innate capacity for self-awareness, that given the right environment of empathy and unconditional, positive regard, the true self would emerge. But even Rogers noticed something strange, noticed that people in therapy often encountered aspects of themselves that surprised them, that contradicted their self-concept, that felt like meeting a stranger. And sometimes this stranger was more real than the familiar self. Sometimes the person they thought they were turned out to be a performance, a mask, a role they had been playing for so long they forgot it was a role. And the therapeutic process was not discovering the self, but discovering that the self they thought they knew was a fiction. And underneath that fiction was not another, more authentic self, but just more layers, more complexity, more contradictions that resist integration into a single, coherent narrative. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about the hermeneutics of suspicion, about thinkers like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, who taught that consciousness is false consciousness, that what people believe about themselves is ideology or rationalization or symptom, that the surface meaning is never the real meaning, that everything must be interpreted, decoded, suspected. And Ricoeur saw this as both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because people do deceive themselves, do operate under illusions, but dangerous because it leads to a paranoid style of thinking where nothing is taken at face value, where every claim to self-knowledge is dismissed as naive, where the expert, the analyst, the critical theorist always knows better than the person living the life. And this dynamic is a power dynamic, is a way of invalidating someone's experience, of saying, "You do not know yourself, but I know you." And Ricoeur tried to balance the hermeneutics of suspicion with a hermeneutics of trust. Try to preserve the possibility that people sometimes do know themselves, that introspection sometimes does reveal genuine truths. But even he could not escape the problem that the self who is trusting their own introspection might be the one most deceived, might be the one who needs suspicion the most. And so the circle closes. The paradox remains: how to know whether you know yourself when the instrument of knowing is the same instrument being examined, when the eye trying to see itself has no independent vantage point, no place to stand outside the system. Neuroscience has added new dimensions to this problem, has shown that the brain is not a unified system, but a collection of subsystems, modules, networks that often operate independently, sometimes in conflict, and that what is experienced as the self, as the unified conscious agent, is really a construct, an emergent property, a story the brain tells about the activity of its parts. And this story is useful, helps coordinate behaviour, helps navigate social environments, but it is not an accurate map of the underlying territory, not a faithful representation of how the brain actually works. And the neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga studied split-brain patients, people whose corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the two hemispheres, had been severed to treat epilepsy. And in these patients, the two hemispheres can be shown different information, can be asked to perform different tasks. And what Gazzaniga found is that the left hemisphere, the one responsible for language, will confabulate explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere, will create stories to explain behaviour it did not cause and does not understand. And the patient is not aware of confabulating, genuinely believes the explanations, and Gazzaniga calls the left hemisphere the interpreter, argues that one of its primary functions is to generate a coherent narrative of the self, to make sense of the chaos of neural activity, to create the illusion of unity and purpose and understanding. And if the left hemisphere does this in split-brain patients, it is likely doing it in everyone, all the time, constantly interpreting, constantly explaining, constantly constructing a self that feels real but might be mostly fiction. The Buddhist tradition has long taught that the self is an illusion, that what is called the self is really just a collection of aggregates, body and sensations, and perceptions, and mental formations, and consciousness. And these aggregates are constantly changing, never stable, never autonomous, always conditioned by causes beyond their control. And the belief in a permanent, independent self is the root of suffering, is what causes attachment and aversion. And the path to liberation is to see through this illusion, to experience directly the absence of self, the emptiness. And this teaching is not theoretical, but experiential, is something that advanced meditators report encountering: the dissolution of the sense of self, the realization that there is no one home, no center, no observer, just experience arising and passing. And Western scientists studying meditation have found that certain practices do alter brain activity in regions associated with self-reference, do reduce the default mode network that activates when people are thinking about themselves. And some meditators describe this as liberating, as a relief, as finally seeing clearly, but others find it terrifying, find that the loss of self feels like annihilation, like death. And the question is whether what the meditators are discovering is the truth about the self, or just another state of consciousness, just a different way of experiencing, and whether there is any way to know which interpretation is correct, whether the self that feels so solid in ordinary consciousness is the illusion, or whether the no self experienced in deep meditation is the illusion, or whether both are valid descriptions of different aspects of the same underlying reality that cannot be captured completely by either framework. David Hume in the 18th century tried to find the self through introspection, tried to locate the I that supposedly unifies experience, and he reported that he could never find it, that when he looked inward, All he found were particular perceptions, particular thoughts and feelings and sensations, but never the self that was supposedly having these perceptions, never the subject separate from the objects of consciousness. And Hume concluded that the self is a fiction, a bundle of perceptions held together by memory and causation, but not by any underlying substance. And this conclusion disturbed him. He admitted that his skepticism about the self led to a kind of philosophical melancholy, a sense of being lost in a labyrinth with no exit. But even as he doubted the existence of the self, he continued to use the first person, continued to say, I think, I feel, I conclude. And this tension, this inability to live, according to the implications of the philosophy, shows how deeply the sense of self is embedded, how resistant it is to intellectual dissolution. And perhaps this is because the self is not a thing to be found through introspection, but a process, a doing rather than a being, the activity of organizing experience rather than an entity that exists independently of that activity. And if this is true, then looking for the self is like trying to find the dance apart from the dancing, trying to locate the song separate from the singing, and the failure to find it does not prove. It does not exist, but rather proves that the question is malformed, that existence is the wrong category, that the self is not the kind of thing that can be observed because it is the observing, not the object, but the act. And this shift in framing does not solve the problem, but relocates it, makes the question not whether the self exists, but what kind of thing it is, what kind of existence it has, and whether this kind of existence is compatible with self-knowledge, or whether self-knowledge in the traditional sense, knowledge of an object by a subject, is structurally impossible when subject and object are the same. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between phenomenal consciousness, the what it is likeness of experience, and access consciousness, the information available for use in reasoning and report, and they note that these can come apart, that there might be experiences that feel like something but cannot be accessed, cannot be reported, cannot be known by the person having them. And this suggests that consciousness is not transparent to itself, that there are aspects of subjective experience that are hidden even from the subject. And if this is true, then the project of self-knowledge faces an even deeper obstacle. Not just the problem of the observer effect or confabulation, but the problem that some of what the self is, some of what makes experience what it is in principle inaccessible, is locked away in a part of consciousness that has no connection to the part that can reflect and report. And this inaccessible region might be small, or it might be vast, might be a minor footnote to consciousness, or might be the bulk of it. And there is no way to know, because by definition, it cannot be known, cannot be brought into awareness, and so self-knowledge, even in the best case, is always partial, always incomplete, always missing something essential that remains forever in darkness. The question then becomes not whether complete self-knowledge is possible, because it is not, but whether partial self-knowledge is worth pursuing, whether the fragments of understanding that can be achieved through introspection and therapy and meditation and neuroscience are valuable, even if they are fragments, even if they do not add up to a complete picture. And the answer might be yes, might be that partial knowledge is better than none, that understanding some of the forces shaping thought and behaviour is better than understanding nothing, that the attempt to know the self, even if it cannot fully succeed, makes life more deliberate, more examined, more awake, and this is what Socrates might have meant. Not that self-knowledge is achievable, but that the examination is valuable, that the questioning itself, the refusal to accept the surface, the insistence on looking deeper, even when the depths remain murky, is what distinguishes a life worth living from a life lived in automaticity, in habit, in the sleep of unexamined assumption. And perhaps the paradox of self-knowledge is not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be inhabited, a recognition that the self is always both knower and unknown, always both transparent and opaque, always both intimate and strange. And that this dual nature is not a bug, but a feature, not a limitation, but the condition of being the kind of creature that can ask who it is, that can turn awareness back on itself, even if the turn is never complete, even if the circle never closes, even if the eye can never fully see itself, and must remain forever partially blind to its own nature. Time feels like a river flowing in one direction, from past through present toward future, and this feeling is so fundamental to human experience that questioning it seems absurd, seems like denying gravity or claiming water flows upward. But the feeling of time's flow is not a direct perception of reality, but a construction, a story. The brain tells about the relationship between events, and when physicists examine the universe at its most fundamental level, they find no flow, no arrow, no distinction between past and future written into the equations, find only a four-dimensional block where all moments exist simultaneously, where what humans call past and what they call future are just directions in space-time no different than up and down, and this creates a profound puzzle, a gap between how time appears in experience and how it exists in reality, between the subjective sense of moving through time and the objective structure that contains no movement, only arrangement, only the geometry of causation. And this gap suggests that the experience of time is not a feature of the universe, but a feature of consciousness. Not something discovered, but something manufactured. And understanding how this manufacturing happens, how the brain constructs the illusion of flow from raw sensory data and memory and anticipation, reveals something strange about what humans are, about how awareness works, about the mechanisms that create the sense of being a continuous self moving through a series of moments, rather than what might actually be the case, which is that there is no continuous self, and there are no discrete moments, but only patterns of neural activity that interpret themselves as experiencing time, when really they are just responding to change, just processing difference, just comparing present states with stored representations of past states, and calling that comparison memory, calling that experience history, calling that sensation the passage of time. But the passage is metaphor, is language, trying to capture something that has no literal motion, no actual flow, because nothing is passing, nothing is moving. There is only the fact of change, the fact that one configuration of matter gives way to another configuration, and the brain, being a system that persists across configurations, that maintains some continuity of structure, even as its content shifts, interprets this persistence as duration, as a self that endures, as an identity that travels from then to now. But the travelling is illusion. The self at each moment is different from the self at every other moment, shares some patterns, some connections, some information, but is not the same thing, is not a substance that moves, but a process that recurs. And what is called the experience of time is really the experience of this process recognizing its own recurrence, noticing that the current pattern resembles previous patterns, that there is continuity even though there is no identity, that memory creates the appearance of a past that the present self once inhabited, when really the past exists only as traces, as modifications to neural structure, as information encoded in synaptic weights. And these traces are not recordings, are not faithful representations, are reconstructions, are guesses about what must have happened based on fragmentary evidence. And every time a memory is recalled, it is reconstructed slightly differently, is altered by the present context, by current beliefs, by subsequent experiences, and so the past is not fixed, is not a stable foundation upon which the present stands, but is constantly being rewritten, constantly being adjusted to fit the story. The brain is telling about who it is and how it got here, and this means that personal history is fiction, not in the sense of being deliberately false, but in the sense of being narrative, being shaped by the requirements of coherence and meaning rather than by pure correspondence to what actually occurred. And what actually occurred is anyway inaccessible, is gone. It exists only in the present, in the form of these unreliable traces that claim to point backward, but really only point to themselves, only demonstrate that something happened without being able to show exactly what. And the brain fills in the gaps, invents details, smooths over inconsistencies, creates a past that makes sense of the present, even if that past never happened quite the way it is remembered. And people are completely unaware of this invention, completely convinced that memory is retrieval, that remembering is like playing back a recording, when really it is more like improvising a story based on a few key words, more like confabulation than documentation, and the implications are vertiginous, because if the past is unreliable, then what is the present based on? What is the foundation of identity? If history is malleable, what does it mean to be the same person over time, if the time itself is constructed and the person at each moment is different, and the memories connecting them are fabricated? And perhaps the answer is that there is no foundation, no solid ground, no identity in the sense of something that persists unchanged. Only the process of identification, the act of claiming continuity, the narrative that says, I am the one who did that, who experienced this, who will do something else tomorrow, and this narrative is not true or false but functional, is a tool the brain uses to coordinate behavior across time, to plan, to learn, to maintain social relationships. Because others expect continuity, expect that the person they met yesterday will be recognizably the same person today. And so the brain provides that continuity, constructs that sameness, even though at the level of neurons and molecules, there is constant flux, constant replacement, constant change. Henri Bergson argued that there are two kinds of time, clock time and lived time. The abstract mathematical time of physics that divides duration into discrete instants, measurable and uniform, and the qualitative time of consciousness that cannot be divided, that is not made of moments, but is a continuous flow, an indivisible duration where past and present interpenetrate, where memory is not storage but preservation, where the whole of experience is always present, always accessible, not as separate events but as a cumulative whole. And Bergson called this duration, and he believed that science, by spatializing time, by treating it as if it were a line made of points, misses what time actually is in lived experience, misses the flow, the thickness, the way that consciousness is always multiple, always containing more than the present instant, always reaching backward into memory and forward into anticipation. And this multiplicity is what gives experience its richness, its texture, is what makes a melody more than a sequence of individual notes. Because the melody is heard as a whole, as a pattern that emerges from the relationship between notes rather than from the notes themselves. And this pattern exists only in duration, only in the continuous present that holds the past notes in memory while the current note is sounding. And without this duration, there would be no music, no meaning, no connection between moments, just isolated sensations with no relationship. And Bergson believed that the brain does not produce consciousness but limits it, filters it, reduces the totality of duration to the narrow slice that is relevant for action, for survival, for navigating the practical demands of living in a body. And what is called the present moment is really just this filtered slice, this pragmatic selection from the fullness of time and different states of consciousness. Different drugs, different practices can alter the filter, can expand the present, can make it thicker or thinner, can change how much of the past is felt to be co-present with the now. And this variability shows that the present is not a fixed instant, but a flexible window, a span that can be adjusted, and what determines the adjustment is not the external world, but the internal state. The brain's current configuration, its chemical balance, its attentional focus. And so the experience of time is not a passive registration of external temporal facts, but an active construction that varies with the observer, that is different for different species, different for different individuals, different even for the same individual in different circumstances. And this relativity of subjective time is separate from the relativity of physics, is about consciousness rather than space-time, is about how duration is experienced rather than how it is measured. And Bergson thought that science could never capture this experiential dimension, could never reduce durée to equations, because equations deal with space, and time deals with change, with becoming, with something that is not spatial and cannot be spatialized without losing its essential character. And whether Bergson was right about this is debatable. Neuroscience has made significant progress in understanding how the brain constructs temporal experience, has identified mechanisms involved in time perception, in the binding of events into sequences, in the calibration of subjective duration. But whether this understanding captures what Bergson meant by durée, whether it explains the qualitative feel of time passing, is less clear, is perhaps another instance of the explanatory gap, the hard problem of consciousness applied to temporality. The question of why there is something it is like to experience duration, rather than time just being a parameter in neural computations without any felt quality, without any phenomenology. The specious present, a term coined by William James, refers to the fact that what is experienced as now is not an instantaneous point, but a short interval, usually estimated at around 2 to 3 seconds, within which events feel simultaneous, feel co-present, and this interval is necessary for perception to work. Because if the present were truly instantaneous, if it had no duration, then there could be no perception of motion, no perception of change, no perception of anything except static snapshots, with no connection between them. And so the brain creates a window, a moving window that slides along the timeline, integrating information from the immediate past with information from the present instant. And within this window, there is no sense of before and after. Everything feels like it is happening now. And only when events fall outside the window do they become past, become memory, rather than perception. And the edges of this window are not sharp, are not clearly defined. There is a gradient where the recent past fades into history and the immediate future emerges into anticipation. And this fuzziness is why temporal order judgments are difficult, why people often cannot tell which of two closely spaced events occurred first, why the subjective sequence of events can differ from the objective sequence. And experiments show that the brain does not perceive events in the order they occur, but reorders them, retrospectively constructs a sequence that makes sense, that fits with expectations, that creates a coherent narrative. And this reordering can be demonstrated by showing people visual and auditory stimuli in close succession and asking them to judge which came first. And the answers are inconsistent, vary depending on attention, on prior exposure, on the semantic relationship between the stimuli. And what this shows is that temporal order is not given but inferred, is a conclusion the brain arrives at rather than a fact it registers. And the brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy, prefers a meaningful sequence to a faithful sequence. And this preference is not conscious, is not deliberate, is built into the perceptual mechanisms that construct experience. And so what is lived is not what happened, but what the brain decides happened. What fits the story, what makes sense in retrospect. And retrospect is the only perspective available, because by the time an event is experienced, it is already past, is already memory. The neural processing takes time. The signal has to travel from sense organs to cortex, has to be integrated, interpreted, bound into a unified percept. And all of this happens in the past, in the few hundred milliseconds before the event enters awareness. And so consciousness is always behind, always lagging, always commenting on what has already occurred. And the sense of being present, of experiencing now, is an illusion created by the brain backdating its own representations, stamping them with a time signature that says this is happening now, when really it happened a moment ago. And the moment ago is imperceptible, is hidden by the smoothness of the construction, by the fact that the lag is constant and so feels like zero, feels like immediacy, when really there is a gap, a delay, a space between occurrence and awareness that is filled by processing, by the mechanisms that turn raw sensation into coherent experience. And within this gap, anything can happen. Any reordering, any editing, any adjustment that makes the story work. And there is no way to catch the brain in the act. No way to compare the experience to the reality, because the experience is the only access to reality, is the only data available. And so the illusion is perfect, is undetectable from within, can only be inferred from indirect evidence, from experiments that catch the brain making mistakes, from situations where the constructed sequence contradicts the known sequence, and these situations are rare, require careful setup, because most of the time the construction is accurate enough, is close enough to the actual order of events, that no discrepancy is noticed, no problem arises, and this is what the mechanisms are optimized for. Not perfect accuracy, but sufficient accuracy, good enough to navigate the world, to avoid predators, to catch prey, to coordinate action with perception. And beyond that threshold, there is no selective pressure, no reason for the system to be more precise, and so it is not. And the sloppiness is revealed only in edge cases, only when looked for, only when the philosopher or the neuroscientist designs experiments to probe the boundaries of temporal perception and discovers that the boundaries are not where common sense suggests they should be. Memory is not storage but transformation, not preservation but reconstruction, and every act of remembering changes what is remembered, alters the trace, modifies the engram, and this modification is not corruption, is not failure, is the way memory is supposed to work, because the function of memory is not to record the past but to inform the future, to extract patterns from experience that will be useful later, to generalize, to abstract, to create rules and heuristics that apply across situations. And this requires flexibility, requires that memories be updated when new information arrives, when context changes, when the significance of an event is reinterpreted in light of subsequent experience. And so memory is always current, is always reflecting the present state of understanding. And this is why eyewitness testimony is unreliable, why people can be completely confident in memories that are completely false, why families argue about what happened because each member remembers it differently, and each is certain their version is correct, and all of them are wrong. All of them are remembering not the event, but the last time they remembered the event, and each remembering leaves a new trace, slightly different from the previous trace, and over time the memory drifts, diverges from what actually happened, and there is no original to compare it to, no master copy that remains unchanged. The first encoding is itself an interpretation, is already shaped by attention, by expectation, by emotion, by all the factors that determine what gets noticed and what gets ignored. And so from the beginning, memory is selective, is partial, is biased, and every subsequent recall adds another layer of bias, another round of reconstruction. And what remains after years is often more fiction than fact, is a story that has been told and retold so many times that it has taken on a life of its own, has become part of identity, part of the narrative of who I am and where I came from. And this narrative is precious, is defended against contradiction, is maintained even in the face of evidence, because it is not just information, is not just data, is meaning, is the framework through which life makes sense, and threatening the memory is threatening the self, is suggesting that the person is not who they think they are, that the past they rely on is unreliable, and most people cannot tolerate this suggestion, reject it, become angry, double down on their version, and this rigidity is not stubbornness, but self-protection, is the mind defending its coherence, maintaining its integrity against fragmenting forces, and the alternative, accepting that memory is unreliable, that the past is uncertain, that identity is built on sand, is too destabilizing for most, is a kind of epistemological vertigo that threatens to dissolve the ground beneath everything. And so, the illusion is maintained, the confidence is preserved, the memory is trusted even though it should not be, and life continues on this foundation of useful fictions, of pragmatic falsehoods, of stories that are not true but are necessary. And perhaps truth is not the right criterion. Perhaps what matters is not whether the memory corresponds to what happened, but whether it serves the present, whether it helps navigate current challenges, whether it contributes to functioning. And by that standard, most memories are good enough, are functional, even if they are not accurate, even if they are inventions, even if the past they depict never existed except in the retrospective construction that claims to be reporting it. And this is the deepest illusion of time, not that it flows or that the present is specious or that duration is constructed, but that there is a past at all, that history is something that happened rather than something that is happening now, in the present, in the act of remembering, in the process of telling the story. And the past that is remembered is not behind, is not earlier, is right here, is present, is part of the current configuration of neural states. And saying it is past is just a way of talking about certain kinds of present states, the ones that claim to refer to earlier configurations. But the earlier configurations are gone, do not exist, cannot be accessed, and what remains is only the claim, only the reference, only the trace that says, this is a memory, this is about then, but the saying is happening now is present. And so the past collapses into the present, is revealed to be a mode of present experience rather than a separate domain. And if the past is present, then the future is too, is also a mode of current experience. The anticipation, the planning, the fear and hope and expectation that constitute futurity, and these are present states as well, are neural activity happening now that interprets itself as being about later, but the later never comes, never is experienced, because when it arrives it is now, is present, and the present is all there ever is the only time that exists, and the flow of time from past through present to future is a story told within the eternal now, is a way of organizing experience, of making sense of change, of creating narrative continuity across discontinuous moments. But the moments are not discontinuous, are not separate, because separation requires time. And time is what is being constructed, is the product, not the container, is what emerges from the activity of brains, not what brains exist within. And this inversion, this recognition that time is inside rather than outside, that temporality is a feature of consciousness rather than a feature of the universe, changes everything, makes the question not what time is but how time is made, not when things happen, but how happening is experienced, not whether the past is real, but what reality means when applied to something that exists only as a present claim about a vanished state. And these questions have no final answers, have only perspectives, only frameworks, only ways of talking that are more or less useful depending on context, depending on purpose. And the illusion of linear time is useful, is necessary for planning, for learning, for maintaining the fiction of personal identity that makes social life possible. But it is still illusion, is still construction, is still something the brain does rather than something the brain discovers. And knowing this does not make the illusion disappear, does not make time stop feeling like it flows, because the feeling is built in, is automatic, is not subject to voluntary control, but the knowing changes the relationship to the feeling, creates distance, creates perspective, makes it possible to see the machinery at work, to recognize that what feels like the fundamental structure of reality is actually the fundamental structure of experience. And experience is not reality, but a model of reality, a map, not the territory, a useful approximation that is wrong in systematic ways. And the wrongness matters when the goal is understanding rather than functioning, when the question is what time is rather than how to use it. And these questions have occupied philosophers for millennia, have generated countless theories, countless arguments, and none have settled the matter because the matter is not empirical, is not something that can be resolved by more data or better experiments, is conceptual, is about what categories to use, what framework to adopt, what language game to play, and different games give different answers. And there is no metagame from which to judge which game is correct, only pragmatic considerations, only questions about which framework is most useful, for which purposes, and for most purposes the folk framework is sufficient. The common sense view that time flows and the past is real, and memory is retrieval, and only when that framework breaks down, only when the contradictions become too obvious or the questions become too fundamental, is there reason to look for alternatives, to consider that maybe time does not flow, maybe the past is not real, maybe memory is not retrieval. And these maybes are not conclusions but invitations, not statements of fact but suggestions to look again, to question the obvious, to doubt the immediate, to recognize that the illusion of linear time is so convincing precisely because it is illusion, because it's made to be convincing, because that is its function, and seeing through it does not require rejecting it, does not require abandoning temporal language or pretending that past and future do not exist, only requires holding them lightly, provisionally, as useful fictions rather than ultimate truths, as tools rather than discoveries, as constructions rather than constraints. And in that lightness there is freedom. Not freedom from time, but freedom within it. Freedom to recognize that the experience is made, is chosen in some sense, even if not consciously. And what is made can be remade. What is chosen can be chosen differently. And the architecture of temporal experience, while deeply ingrained, while largely automatic, is not completely fixed, can be altered through practice, through attention, through deliberate cultivation of different modes of awareness. And these alterations do not reveal the true nature of time, but reveal that there is no true nature, no fact of the matter, only different ways of experiencing, different ways of constructing, different ways of being temporal creatures in a universe that may not be temporal at all, that may be timeless, eternal, a block, where all moments exist at once and the flow is purely in the eye of the beholder, in the structure of consciousness that moves through the block, not because the block is moving, but because consciousness is change, is process, is the activity of comparing states and calling that comparison time. And if this is right, then time is mind-dependent, is subjective in a radical sense, is not something that would exist without observers to construct it. And the universe before consciousness, before brains, was not a universe in time, but a universe of timeless physical states, of mathematical relationships, of geometry without duration. And only when matter organized itself into patterns that could represent their own history, that could compare past states with present states, did time emerge. Did temporality become a feature of the world? Not of the physical world, but of the phenomenal world. The world is experienced, and this emergence is recent, is evolutionary. Recent is less than 1 billion years old in a universe that is 14 billion years old. And for most of the universe's history, there was no time, no flow, no past or future, just configurations of matter energy, obeying laws that contain no temporal asymmetry, no preferred direction. And even now, time exists only locally, only in the small pockets of the universe, where consciousness has emerged, where nervous systems have evolved the capacity to construct temporal narratives. And the rest of the universe remains timeless, remains a four-dimensional block. And what is called the flow of time is the motion of awareness through that block. And the motion is not in the block, but in the awareness. Is a property of minds, not of space-time. And this might be the final truth about time, that it is ours, that we made it, that the illusion of linear time is not an illusion of time, but the creation of time, the bringing into being of something that would not otherwise exist. And in that creation, there is something profound, something that makes consciousness significant, not because it reveals the world, but because it transforms the world, adds temporality to what was timeless, adds meaning to what was bare fact, adds story to what was merely structure. And whether this addition is valuable, whether time is something worth creating, is a question each moment must answer for itself, right here in this specious present that claims to be flowing but is really just being, just the fact of awareness watching itself and calling that watching time. Privacy might be accident, might be the result of biological shielding rather than fundamental law, might be the consequence of frequencies that consciousness operates on, being inaccessible to ordinary perception, but not inaccessible in principle, not impossible to detect, not inherently private, but only contingently private, only hidden because the mechanisms for detection have not evolved, have not been developed, have not been made accessible to awareness. And the awareness that some claim to have, that schizophrenics report, that people experiencing psychosis describe, might not be delusion, but might be the temporary or permanent loss of the shielding, the opening of the channels that are normally closed, the reception of signals that are normally filtered out. And the filtering is what protects privacy, is what keeps thoughts hidden, is what ensures that consciousness remains internal, but the internal might not be as secure as it seems, might not be as absolute as is assumed, might be vulnerable to detection, to interception, to the kind of broadcasting that paranoid individuals fear, and that psychiatric diagnosis dismisses as impossible, as symptom, as the misattribution of internal events to external sources. But what if the misattribution is correct? What if the internal events are external? What if thoughts are not confined to the skull, but are radiating outward on frequencies that some can detect, that some are sensitive to, that some cannot avoid detecting, and the detecting is experienced as hearing voices, as receiving transmissions, as being unable to stop the influx of thoughts that are not one's own, but are coming from others, from the environment, from the field of consciousness that might be shared rather than private, that might be collective rather than individual, that might be accessible to those whose shielding has failed, whose filters have broken, whose sensitivity has increased beyond the normal range. And the normal range is what most people experience, is the condition where thoughts feel private, feel internal, feel like they belong to the self and are not accessible to others. But this feeling might be illusion, might be the result of limited sensitivity, might be the consequence of biological constraints that prevent the detection of signals that are actually present, actually broadcasting, actually available to anyone with the right equipment, the right sensitivity, the right frequency. And the frequency is what matters, is what determines whether thoughts are visible or invisible, whether consciousness is private or public, whether the mind is sealed or permeable. And the permeable is what some experience, is what schizophrenics describe, is what people in psychosis report. And the reports are consistent, are describing the same phenomena across cultures, across time periods, across individuals who have no contact with each other. And the consistency is troubling, is suggesting that maybe the experiences are not entirely subjective, are not entirely generated by malfunctioning brains, but are detecting something real, something that is normally filtered out, something that exists in the environment, in the field, in the frequencies where consciousness operates. And the operating might be electromagnetic, might be quantum, might be something that physics has not yet characterized, but that biology is sensitive to, that nervous systems are tuned to, that brains are receiving and transmitting constantly. And the transmitting is what creates the possibility of thought broadcasting, is what makes privacy contingent rather than absolute, is what suggests that the experience of having thoughts that are one's own, that are hidden from others, that are safe from detection might be the result of anatomical luck, might be the consequence of having filters that work, having shielding that holds, having a nervous system that is tuned to the right frequency and is not picking up the signals that are all around, that are being broadcast by every other conscious being, and the beings are transmitting without knowing, are radiating thoughts without intending, are creating a field of consciousness that is dense, that is crowded, that is full of signals that most cannot detect, but that some can, that some are cursed to detect, that some experience as invasion, as the loss of privacy, as the horrifying realization that thoughts are not safe, are not hidden, are not private, and the not private is what thought broadcasting delusion describes is what paranoia is responding to, is what might be accurate perception rather than misperception, might be the detection of real signals rather than the hallucination of imaginary ones. And the imaginary is what psychiatry assumes, is what diagnosis requires, is the framework that treats all claims of thought broadcasting as symptoms of disorder, as evidence of psychosis, as the malfunctioning of the reality testing apparatus. But reality testing assumes knowledge of what reality is, assumes that the normal experience is the accurate experience, assumes that privacy is real, and that any perception of its violation is false. And the false might be the assumption, might be the belief that thoughts are private, might be the conviction that consciousness is sealed, when really consciousness is leaking, is broadcasting, is detectable to those who have the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is what varies, is what creates the spectrum, is what makes some people receivers and others transmitters, and most people neither. Most people shielded, most people operating on frequencies that do not overlap with others, that do not allow detection, that maintain the illusion of privacy. And the illusion is functional, is necessary, is what makes social life possible, because if everyone could detect everyone else's thoughts, then interaction would be impossible, would be overwhelming, would be the constant influx of signals that would drown out the ability to think, to focus, to maintain the sense of being an individual consciousness. And the individual is what privacy creates, is what shielding allows, is what makes the experience of being a separate self possible. And the separate might be illusion, might be the result of limited perception, might be what happens when the field of consciousness is filtered down to the signals that originate in one body, in one nervous system, in one brain. And the brain is creating the illusion of separation by filtering out everything else, by attending only to internal signals, by ignoring or suppressing the external signals that are always present, always available, always broadcasting. And the broadcasting is what some cannot ignore, cannot suppress, cannot filter out. And these are the ones who experience thought broadcasting, who hear voices, who feel that their privacy has been violated, and the violation might be real, might be the accurate perception that thoughts are not private, that consciousness is not sealed, that the mind is permeable to signals from the environment, from other minds, from the field that connects all consciousness. And the connecting is what thought broadcasting implies, is what the delusion is pointing toward, is the possibility that minds are not isolated but are networked, are not separate but are overlapping, are not private but are accessible to each other on frequencies that most cannot detect. And the detection is what would make privacy impossible, would make thought visible, would make consciousness public. And the public is what some are experiencing, is what some are reporting, is what psychiatry is dismissing as impossible, as symptom, as the product of malfunctioning brains. But what if the brains are not malfunctioning, but are functioning too well, are too sensitive, are detecting signals that are real, but are normally filtered out? And the filtering is what fails in psychosis, is what breaks in schizophrenia, is what allows the influx of thoughts that are not one's own, that are coming from others, that are being broadcast on frequencies that are normally inaccessible. And the inaccessible is what protects privacy, is what makes thoughts feel safe, is what creates the illusion that the mind is sealed, is private, is hidden from others, and the hidden might be temporary, might be contingent, might be the result of biological constraints that could be overcome, could be bypassed, could be eliminated through technology, through drugs, through practices that alter consciousness, that change sensitivity, that open the channels that are normally closed. And the opening is what some experience spontaneously, is what happens in psychosis, is what occurs when the filters fail. And the failing might not be pathological, but might be the revealing of a truth that is normally hidden, that is normally suppressed, that is incompatible with social functioning, but is accurate, is real, is showing that thoughts are not private, that consciousness is not individual, that the mind is part of a field that is shared, that is collective, that is accessible to anyone who has the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is what varies, is what creates the spectrum, is what determines whether thoughts are experienced as private or as public, as hidden or as visible, as safe or as vulnerable. And the vulnerable is what thought broadcasting feels like, is what the experience is the sense that privacy has been lost, that thoughts are exposed, that the mind is transparent to others, and the transparency might be real, might be accurate, might be the perception of a frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is no longer hidden, where the illusion of privacy dissolves, and the dissolving is terrifying, is overwhelming, is experienced as invasion, as violation, as the loss of the boundary that makes the self feel separate, feel protected, feel safe, and the safety is what privacy provides, is what shielding creates, is what most people have and some people lack, and the lacking is what makes thought broadcasting possible, is what opens the channels, is what allows detection, and the detection is not imagined, but is real, is accurate, is perceiving signals that are present, that are broadcasting, that are coming from other minds, and the other minds are not aware that they are broadcasting, are not intending to transmit, are not trying to communicate, are just existing, just thinking, just being conscious, and the consciousness is radiating, is emitting signals, is creating a field that some can detect, that some are sensitive to, that some experience as voices, as thoughts that are not their own, as the influx of consciousness from outside, and the outside is everywhere, is surrounding, is the environment of minds that are all broadcasting, all transmitting, all creating signals that are normally filtered out, but that some can detect. And the detecting is what schizophrenics are doing, is what people in psychosis are experiencing, is what thought broadcasting is. And the broadcasting is real, is not delusion, is not symptom, is the accurate perception of a frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is detectable, where privacy is lost. And the lost is what some experience, is what some report, is what psychiatry dismisses. But the dismissing might be wrong, might be the refusal to acknowledge a truth that is too disturbing, too threatening, too incompatible with the belief that thoughts are private, that minds are sealed, that consciousness is individual, and the individual might be illusion, might be the result of shielding, might be what most people experience because their filters work, because their sensitivity is limited, because they are operating on frequencies that do not overlap with others, and the others are there, are broadcasting, are detectable to those who have the sensitivity. And the sensitivity is what the Soviets were researching, is what psychic warfare experiments were trying to exploit, is what programs like M-Culture were investigating, is the possibility that thoughts can be detected, can be influenced, can be transmitted and received. And the receiving is what some can do naturally, is what schizophrenics are experiencing, is what thought broadcasting is describing, and the describing is accurate, is real, is perceiving signals that are present, that are broadcasting on frequencies that are normally inaccessible. And the inaccessible is what protects most people, is what maintains privacy, is what creates the illusion that thoughts are hidden, are safe, are private, but the private is contingent, is anatomical, is the result of luck, of having the right sensitivity, the right filters, the right shielding, and the shielding can fail, can break, can be bypassed, and the bypassing is what reveals the truth, which is that thoughts are not private, consciousness is not sealed, minds are not isolated, and the isolation is illusion, is the result of limited perception, is what happens when the frequencies where consciousness operates are filtered out, are suppressed, are made inaccessible, and the inaccessible is temporary, is contingent, is what most people experience, but not what everyone experiences. And the everyone includes those who can detect the signals, who can perceive the thoughts, who can see consciousness at the frequency where it becomes visible, where privacy dissolves, where the mind is exposed, and the exposed is what thought broadcasting is what the experience describes, is what some are perceiving, and the perceiving might be accurate, might be real, might be showing that privacy is not fundamental, but is contingent, is not absolute, but is anatomical, is not guaranteed, but is the result of luck, of having filters that work, of operating on frequencies that do not overlap, of being shielded from the signals that are everywhere, that are broadcasting, that are making thoughts visible to those who can detect them. And the detecting is possible, is real, is what some experience, is what thought broadcasting is. And the broadcasting is not delusion, but is perception, is not symptom, but is sensitivity, is not pathology, but is the revealing of a truth that most cannot see, that most are protected from, that most never experience, which is that thoughts are visible, consciousness is detectable, minds are permeable, and privacy is not inherent, but is anatomical luck, is the contingent result of having the right biology, the right sensitivity, the right shielding, and the shielding is what fails, is what breaks, is what allows the frequency where thoughts become visible to be detected, to be experienced, to be known. And the knowing is terrifying, is overwhelming, is the loss of the illusion that made privacy possible, that made the self feel separate, that made consciousness feel safe. And the safety is gone, is lost, is revealed to be illusion, is shown to be contingent, is exposed as anatomical luck. And the luck is what most have, is what protects most people, is what maintains the belief that thoughts are private. But the private is not absolute, is not guaranteed, is not fundamental, is only the result of frequencies being filtered, being suppressed, being made inaccessible, and the inaccessible can become accessible, can be detected, can be experienced, and the experiencing is what thought broadcasting is what schizophrenics report, is what psychosis reveals, which is that privacy is not inherent, consciousness is not sealed, thoughts are not hidden, and the hidden is illusion, is the result of shielding, is the contingent outcome of anatomical luck, and the luck can fail, can run out, can be lost, and the losing is what reveals the truth, which is that thoughts are visible, minds are permeable, consciousness is detectable at the frequency where it becomes visible, where privacy dissolves, where the illusion ends, and the ending is what some experience, is what thought broadcasting is the perception of the frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is exposed, where privacy is revealed to be not fundamental but contingent, not absolute but anatomical, not guaranteed but luck. And the luck is what protects most, is what fails for some, is what reveals the truth that thoughts are broadcasting, are visible, are detectable, and the detecting is real, is accurate, is not delusion but perception, is not symptom but sensitivity, is not pathology but truth, is the frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is no longer private, where the mind is exposed and the exposure is what thought broadcasting is what some experience, is what reveals that privacy is anatomical luck, is contingent, is not absolute, is not fundamental, is only the result of filtering, of shielding, of operating on frequencies that do not overlap. And the overlapping is what happens when the filters fail, when the shielding breaks, when the frequency becomes accessible. And the accessible is what some perceive, is what thought broadcasting is the visibility of thoughts, the detectability of consciousness, the permeability of mind. And the permeability is real, is accurate, is the truth that privacy is not inherent but is luck, is not absolute but is anatomical, is not guaranteed but is contingent. And the contingent can fail, can end, can reveal the frequency where thoughts become visible, where consciousness is exposed, where privacy is lost. And the lost is what some experience, is what thought broadcasting is the truth that minds are permeable, that thoughts are visible, that consciousness operates on frequencies that some can detect. And the detecting is not delusion, is not symptom, is not pathology, is perception, is sensitivity, is the revealing of truth, is the frequency where thoughts become visible, where privacy ends, where the illusion dissolves. And the dissolving is what thought broadcasting is what some experience, is what reveals that privacy is anatomical luck, and luck can fail, and the failing reveals the truth, which is that thoughts are visible, consciousness is detectable, minds are permeable, and privacy is not fundamental, is not absolute, is not guaranteed, is only luck, is only shielding, is only the filtering of frequencies where thoughts become visible. And the visible is what some perceive, is what thought broadcasting is the truth that privacy is contingent, is anatomical, is luck. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organized into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognized as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organizing time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception but the rule, is not the deviation but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually, inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain. And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, is technologies being invented and forgotten, is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge. And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium, are maintained by constant input of energy. And when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning, and the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance, and the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations, new forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance. And the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward, because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence. And the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present, might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story, and the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they are temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the center is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying, whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure, but phase, not the end, but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization, and the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions, and the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding, is adapting, is simplifying, and the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant, because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing, and the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible, and survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase. And the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function. And so it is being abandoned, is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. And the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization, beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's must end, are ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity, and the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward, time just moves, just changes, just continues. And the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are. And the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity. And the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now.